The idea that Jesus never really rose from the grave has actually been around for a long time. Skeptics like to ignore a lot of the plausible evidence, and instead they invent their own ideas about how people might have staged Jesus' death, or maybe he never actually died, or maybe he survived, or maybe the whole resurrection thing is just a big fat hoaxily-doo. But there is some fascinating evidence, historical evidence, for the fact that Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead. This is yet another question that I'm going to address right now. Well, not right now, but in a few seconds. Hey everybody, Jake here. Thanks for tuning in, and thank you for the tremendous amount of support and encouragement that I've received from many of you. I've had a couple people tell me just over the past 2 weeks or so that these videos are part of their family's weekly devotional time, which is awesome to hear. I really want to grow this channel, and there are 2 ways that you can help. Number 1, tell a friend. Get someone you know to subscribe to this channel. And number 2, watch time. One of the biggest ways that YouTube's algorithm can tell if a video is engaging is how much time people spend watching it. So it's super helpful if you can watch the whole video, or let it play while you're driving in the car. Listen to it on audio as you're cleaning the house or something. And of course, click the like button, leave a comment. Anything that gets engagement up is a great boost for this channel. My goal with Rogue Nation is to kind of fill the gap where church teaching falls short. I think one of the biggest shortcomings among many modern churches today is in the area of apologetics, teaching Christians to reason through their faith and understand why we believe the things we believe. I want to equip Christians with confidence that our beliefs are founded upon more than just faith. There is sound reason and logic in the Bible. I want God's people to know not just what they stand for, but why they stand for it. The Bible says a great deception is coming, and it's going to be so great that many Christians will also be deceived. And I don't want you to be one of them. Today, I'm addressing a very important question regarding the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Did it really happen the way the Bible says it happens? Is any of it true? So let's dive in. Most of us know the story, right? It's told in the historical books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, collectively known as the Gospels. These books document the life of Jesus Christ, his birth, his ministry, his teachings, his trial, his execution, and most crucially, his resurrection. The resurrection isn't just a dramatic ending. It's the foundation of the entire Christian faith. That's why I consider this one of the most essential topics for Christians to understand. Because if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then Christianity collapses. Because the whole point of Christ returning to life was to conquer death. This act bridged the separation between God and human beings. So if that didn't happen, what are we even supposed to believe in? There are even some people who say they're Christians, but they don't believe in the resurrection. And I'm sorry, but that does not compute. You can't have Christianity without the resurrection. As theologian Gerald O'Collins put it, in a profound sense, Christianity without the resurrection is not simply Christianity without its final chapter. It is not Christianity at all. The Apostle Paul agrees. In 1 Corinthians 15:14, he writes, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." That's how crucial the resurrection is to the Christian faith. So, can a reasonable person believe the resurrection is worth trusting? Can we trust the resurrection account? Some have suggested that Jesus never actually died on the cross. And this idea goes back to the Quran in the 7th century, and it still shows up in literature and fringe theories. But let's get serious. If we want to evaluate whether the resurrection happened, we first need to ask, can the gospel accounts be trusted? Because if these books can be proven as trustworthy accounts of historical events, then there's no reason not to believe what they say about Jesus' resurrection. And I've touched on this quite a bit in this video series already, so I'm not going to get into it too much more in this video. But if you want a deeper dive on this, check out Craig L. Blumberg's book, The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. He's one of the many historians who has examined the Bible from a purely historical perspective and has arrived at the conclusion that the 4 accounts of Jesus' life as told in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are true and accurate. Blumberg says, Mark and Luke weren't even among the 12 disciples. Matthew was, but as a former hated tax collector, he would have been the most infamous character next to Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus. Do you see what he's saying? The gospel writers were the least likely candidates to start a religion. A former tax collector? A young missionary? A fisherman? If you were making this stuff up, you'd pick prestigious names that would draw attention from uppity scholar types. That's exactly what some later writings did, and many of those were found to be falsified, but the actual Gospels were written by cultural nobodies. This movement should not have caught on, but it did, because the people reading them knew Jesus. Many of the people who had heard Jesus preach, they had witnessed his miracles, they were still alive, including those who hated Jesus. If the gospel writers had made this stuff up, somebody would have been like, hey, that ain't how it went down. But there's no evidence of such rebuttals. I have no idea why my voice goes to that tone when I'm like, hey, yo, Matthew, your gospel stinks. That's not what happened. But there's no evidence that anyone called out the gospel writers for not reporting what was true. Christian writer Papias, writing around AD 125, affirmed the accuracy of Mark's gospel, saying he, quote, made no mistake and included, quote, no false statement. Irenaeus, a historian writing around AD 180, also confirmed the four gospels as legitimate records, each tied to eyewitnesses or direct followers. Eyewitness testimony plus external historical evidence affirms that the Gospels are credible. Yet many people who have never really stopped to examine the evidence, they love to say, well, the authors were biased. Okay, but bias doesn't always equal dishonesty. Everyone writes with a purpose, and most authors believe what they're writing about. These authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were either eyewitnesses to the events they wrote about, or they carefully recorded eyewitness testimonies of those who did. My point is, since the gospel accounts have proven historically reliable in every test they've ever been given, there's no reason not to take their account of the resurrection seriously. Like I said, I'm not going to harp on this first point too much because I already have in previous videos, so check those out if you're curious. Right now, I want to get into some specifics. There are lots of aspects about Jesus' death that people call into question, such as, could Jesus have been resuscitated? Short answer, no. Long answer, absolutely no. For an even longer answer, I turn to Dr. Alexander Metherell, a prominent physician who has studied the history, archaeology, and medical data related to crucifixion. He's written and edited numerous medical books and texts, and he says that Jesus was unquestionably dead on the cross. He says that Jesus would have experienced what's called hypovolemic shock due to a sudden loss of blood during his scourging. This wasn't just a beatdown. Scourging was designed to shred flesh and mutilate victims. Sometimes it's called flogging, but flogging was generally done with long wooden poles or whips, and it was meant to beat someone, not flay them alive. When it came to scourging, the Romans used whips with metal and bone embedded into the cords. Traditionally, the victim would be struck 39 times, 13 on the chest, 13 on the back right shoulder, and 13 on the back left shoulder. But Roman soldiers weren't known for restraint. They could, and often did, inflict far more lashes than that, and some victims died before crucifixion even began. There's a vivid description of this in the autobiographical novel The Adventures of Ralph Rashley. The first dozen strokes from the knotted rawhide lash were like jagged wire tearing furrows into his flesh, and the second dozen seemed like the filling of those furrows with molten lead, burning like fire into the raw flesh. Dr. Metherell said, scourging does four things. First, the heart races to try to pump blood that isn't there. Second, the blood pressure drops, causing fainting or collapse. Third, the kidneys stop producing urine to maintain what volume is left. And fourth, the person becomes very thirsty as the body craves fluids to replace the lost blood volume. And we see these effects play out in the highly medically accurate description of Jesus' scourging. We see it in the way that he stumbles while he carried his cross, and when he asked for water as he was hanging on it. This is medical information that can be found in the crucifixion account. Bottom line is, after his scourging, Jesus was already near death. So what happened medically during the crucifixion that can affirm for us that he was dead? Have you ever considered this? Because anyone who does has to arrive at the conclusion that there's no way Jesus could have survived this. First of all, the agony that Jesus experienced on the cross was so great that they had to invent a new word for it. The word was excruciating, or ex cruciatus. It literally means out of the cross. Nerves were likely severed, his shoulders, both of them, dislocated. Some scholars even see Psalm 22:14 as a prediction of this, where the psalmist says, "All my bones are out of joint." Most victims of crucifixion died from slow asphyxiation. Dr. Methrel said, as the person slows down his breathing, he goes into what is called respiratory acidosis. The carbon dioxide in the blood is dissolved as carbonic acid, causing the acidity of the blood to increase. This eventually leads to an irregular heartbeat. In fact, with his heart beating erratically, Jesus would have known that he was at the moment of death, which is why he was able to say, "Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit." And then he died of cardiac arrest. How can we be certain of this? Because of what happens next. Dr. Methrel says that as Jesus was on the cross, a watery fluid would have built up around his heart and lungs, a process called effusion. This is why when the Roman centurion pierced Jesus' side, the Bible says that blood and water poured out. This detail was recorded by John. John was not a doctor. He would not have known this effusion process was even happening in Jesus' body. So the fact that the Bible's account of his death says that something like water flowed from his chest cavity is not only highly medically accurate, but is evidence that Jesus was, in fact, dead. Could he have been resuscitated? No, absolutely not. If someone claims otherwise, they need to invent an entirely different crucifixion scenario that readily available historical documents do not support. And let's not forget that crucifixion was designed to be fatal, period. According to Dr. William Edwards in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the whole point of crucifixion was to kill someone. So the idea that Jesus somehow survived is simply preposterous. Edwards writes, "No one was intended to survive crucifixion, and so the body was not released to the family until the soldiers were sure that the victim was dead. Roman soldiers were professionals when it came to murder. If a prisoner survived execution, the soldiers who were in charge could have been executed themselves. So they didn't mess around. They had to make sure that Jesus was dead. That was their job. Even if somehow he had survived, are we seriously supposed to believe that he crawled out of the tomb with shredded feet and dislocated shoulders and convinced his followers that he'd conquered death? That was the triumphant Son of God? Dr. Methrel says, a person in that kind of pathetic condition would never have inspired his disciples to go out and proclaim that he's the Lord of life who had triumphed over the grave. It's preposterous to think that if he had appeared to them in that awful state, his followers would have been prompted to start a worldwide movement based on the hope that someday they too would have a resurrection body like his. There's just no way. So now we come to the million-dollar question. Could Jesus have really come back to life? I want to quickly look at three different aspects of this: his followers, the tomb itself, and the stolen body theory. His followers. Jesus' disciples scattered after his execution. Judas betrayed him. Peter denied him. John was the only one present at the foot of the cross during the execution. The rest of them, Matthew, Thomas, Philip, they thought their lives were over, and all they could do was go hide in some tenement building. But something happened that was so powerful, so profound, that it inspired them to come out of hiding 3 days later. They were suddenly fearless, passionate, willing to face prison, beatings, even death, if it meant sharing the news of Jesus with thousands of people. That kind of radical shift makes no sense unless they had truly seen something extraordinary, like a man who had been dead and was alive again. But it wasn't just the disciples. Take James, Jesus' brother, for example. The Gospels tell us that Jesus' family were embarrassed by him. James was a skeptic, okay? And in Jewish culture, that kind of family rejection was a big deal. It was shameful if a rabbi's own family did not accept him. But something changed. James became a leader in the early church, and we know from the Jewish historian Josephus that James was later stoned to death because of his belief in Jesus Christ. What could change a skeptical brother into a martyr? Only one answer makes sense. James saw the risen Christ. Number 2, the tomb. The custom in Rome was to leave those who had been crucified on the cross until birds and bugs and wild animals had devoured most of them. They were then cast into a common grave and forgotten. Normally, that's true. And if all we had to go on was what we know about the customs of the time period, I would agree that, yes, that's probably what happened to Jesus. But in this particular instance, we have a little more information to consider. First, Jesus was crucified during Passover, and Jewish law required that bodies be taken down before the Sabbath. That's why Roman authorities allowed Jesus' body to be removed from the cross. Second, Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, came forward and asked Pilate for the body so he could bury Jesus in a tomb that he owned. That detail matters. This wasn't an unmarked grave. It was a known location, and the burial of Jesus is one of the most well-supported facts in New Testament scholarship. But still, some people object to this, and they say, well, that Joseph dude, wasn't he a member of the Sanhedrin? And didn't the Sanhedrin vote unanimously to crucify Jesus? Yeah. The Sanhedrin voted unanimously. But Luke 23:51 clarifies that Joseph disagreed with the decision. The wording of the verse suggests that Joseph may have excused himself on that particular day. Now, the Sanhedrin was much like some modern legislatures, where not every member needed to be present for a decision to be made, which is how those snakes were able to get a unanimous vote against Jesus. Professor William Craig, a world-renowned expert on the resurrection, said, "The majority of New Testament scholars today agree that the burial account of Jesus is fundamentally reliable." Dr. Craig quotes John A.T. Robinson, a late Cambridge University New Testament scholar, as saying, "The honorable burial of Jesus is one of the earliest and best attested facts that we have about the historical Jesus." So some people want to believe that Jesus' body was left to rot, which, hey, they can believe that if they want to, but historical evidence does not support this. Was the body stolen? Some skeptics suggest that Jesus' body was stolen. This was even a concern of the Pharisees of that time period. Matthew 27:64 records that they asked for Jesus' tomb to be sealed so no one could steal the body and claim it was a resurrection. On your screen is an illustration of how first century tombs were built, according to what archaeologists have been able to deduce after excavating various burial sites. There was a small opening that led into the tomb. On the ground in front of the opening was a groove on a slight incline. This would allow for a large disc-shaped stone to be placed into the groove and rolled down the incline to seal the door. These stones were said to weigh about 2,000, 3,000 pounds, and once the stone was in place, it took several very strong men to roll the stone back up the incline and expose the opening. So imagine this, if you will. A group of terrified fishermen, most of them uneducated, ordinary men. They'd been in hiding for 3 days, terrified for their lives. They somehow sneak past trained Roman guards, silently roll a 2-ton stone up an incline, steal the body, and then go out and confidently preach a lie that would eventually cause them all to be beaten, thrown in jail, and most likely martyred. That's not just an unlikely scenario. That's ridiculous. The death of Jesus is one of the most certain facts of ancient history. Scholars from all backgrounds, Christian, atheist, Jewish, agnostic, they all agree he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. We know that his followers believed to the point of death that they saw him alive again. We know his skeptical brother James became a believer. We know the tomb was found empty. We know the body was never found. There's only one explanation that accounts for these known facts. Professor William Craig said, "I would argue that the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead is not at all improbable. In fact, based on the evidence, it's the best explanation for what happened. What is improbable is the hypothesis that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. That, I would agree, is outlandish. Any hypothesis would be more probable than saying the corpse of Jesus spontaneously came back to life. But the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead doesn't contradict science or any known facts of experience. All it requires is the hypothesis that God exists. And I think there are good, independent reasons for believing that he does." So much more I'd like to say on this. I stumbled down a really fascinating rabbit trail debunking some of the alleged contradictions in the resurrection account, such as the different details recorded in each of the Gospels. Who arrived at the tomb first? Who was with whom? When exactly was the tomb opened and closed? When exactly did the angel appear? But it was all too much to stick into one video. Maybe I'll revisit all that stuff some other time. For now, I hope this video has helped you craft an answer to the question of whether or not there is any proof to the Bible's account of Jesus' resurrection. And if you've made it this far into the video, for whatever reason, please give it a like. Consider subscribing for more of my rambling content. Play nice in the comments, and thanks for watching. Until next time.